So, we are back with part 3 of Elements of a Happy Sentence, the final installment in this series. So we're going to begin with parallelism, another element of a happy sentence. Every happy sentence has to be parallel. Here we have parallel lines. I think it's good to begin with this because this is analogous to how parallelism works in sentences. Parallel lines are a pair of lines that never intersect. They just exactly mirror each other forever. They look exactly the same. They point the same direction. So that's parallel lines from that. And now you also need to maintain parallelism in sentences in a couple of ways. And the first one is called faulty parallelism. So, like I said, just like lines, the elements of a sentence can exist in parallel, and sometimes should exist in parallel. And the rule here is that equivalent elements of a sentence or a list must have identical form. What does that mean? Equivalent elements must have identical form. This is best explained through examples, so I think you'll understand in a second. And I think if you look back at this slide after looking at the example, it'll make a little more sense. But basically, equivalent portions of the sentence have to have identical form, and if they don't, faulty parallelism results. Okay, so let's look at an example of this. And you'll see why this is tilted in a second. While watching the apes, Carla carefully observed their eating habits, their sleeping patterns, and whoa, what's going on here? How they interacted with humans. So why did I illustrate the slide this way, if you couldn't tell already? Because these portions of the sentence are in parallel, just like lines. This one is not. Let's look at why. So here, while watching the apes, Carla carefully observed, and after this I'm going to list some things that Carla observes. And here I have their eating habits, or first I should say, I'm going to list some things that Carla observes. So all three of these are equivalent elements or equivalent parts of the sentence. That's what I mean on the previous slide when I say equivalent elements. These are three equivalent elements. And the rule is that they have to then have identical form. Now these first two do. It's some pronoun there, followed by the thing that the apes are doing. So their eating habits, okay, their sleeping patterns, okay, again the same pattern. But then if we look down here, this is not the same pattern we observed up here. This is how they interacted with humans. It doesn't begin with a pronoun and then say what they're doing. This is a totally different structure for this clause. And that's not acceptable because these are equivalent elements of the sentence. They've got to have identical form for it to be considered grammatically correct. So we can change it, and instead of saying how, we can follow this pattern of having a pronoun there, followed by interactions with humans, the thing that Carla's observing the apes do. And now we're fine. While watching the apes, Carla carefully observed their eating habits, their sleeping patterns, and their interactions with humans. All of these parts are in parallel. You'll notice that these two are a little different from this one down here. Here I said eating habits and sleeping patterns, and here there's no ing, there's just interactions with humans, but that little amount of variation is okay, because the basic structure of these three portions is identical. Okay, now let's look at another example. Skylar, I don't know who that is, listens to Justin Bieber's music while walking, okay, showering, interesting, and during the middle of the night. So something is wrong here. This is not in parallel. Okay, these are three equivalent portions of the sentence. They're places or states of being while Skylar listens to Justin Bieber's music in. One of them is walking, okay, and showering. These are both verbs conjugated in the progressive tense. These have identical form. But then we look down here, during the middle of the night. And this example is tricky on purpose. The ing makes you think at first glance that this is fine. But during is a preposition. These are verbs conjugated in the progressive tense. So this is in fact not in parallel with these two. You can change it to "and lying in bed at night." So again, first, now lying is a verb conjugated in the progressive tense, so it's parallel. There's a little extra information here. That's fine. These three portions don't have to be completely identical. They just have to have a basic identical form, and they do now. So, parallels. Now, the other type of parallelism students need to know about is called faulty comparison. So the rule here is that only objects of equivalent type can be compared. Again, this probably sounds sort of vague. We'll go through an example and that should clarify what I mean. But the rule is only objects of equivalent type can be compared. Alright, this is a very, very tricky example. Read through this and see if you can figure out what's wrong. I can peel more potatoes than you and Jimmy combined. What's wrong is that these are not equivalent. These are not objects of equivalent type. They seem to be, but they're actually not. So I can peel more potatoes than you and Jimmy combined. These are different. Peeling potatoes is an action. I can peel more potatoes. What are we comparing it to? You and Jimmy combined. Sorry, wrong way. That is people. We're comparing an action with people. Now I know implicitly we're not comparing an action with people, we're comparing an action with another action, because by saying you and Jimmy combined, what we really mean is the amount of potatoes you and Jimmy combined can peel. But we're not being explicit about that, and with proper grammar, we have to be explicit. So if we just read this sentence, it's comparing an action and people, and that is a faulty comparison. So to fix it, we can change it to then you and Jimmy can peel combined. Now we're comparing an action, peeling potatoes, to an action, peeling potatoes. And we're all good. The next element that we're going to examine is called organization. Every happy sentence has to be organized. And the sub-rule we're going to talk about here is misplaced modifiers. So what is a modifier? A modifier is just a phrase that gives additional information about some subject in a sentence. That's a modifier. Then there's a simple rule governing the placement of modifiers. A modifier must either directly precede, so directly come before, or follow, and it doesn't have to directly follow, just follow the subject it modifies. Modifier has to directly precede or follow the subject that it modifies. So what this is saying in other words is that a modifier can't come way before the subject that it modifies. It has to either directly come before it or come after it. Otherwise, it's misplaced. So, as we like to do, we'll look at an example. What do you think is wrong here? Or I don't know, is anything wrong here? Because she was so good at teaching and playing Frisbee, the Golden State Warriors decided to draft Angela for the 2018-19 season. Well, Angela is the subject of this sentence. Because she was so good at teaching and playing Frisbee is a phrase that gives more information about a subject. This is a modifier. Is it placed correctly? That's the question we want to ask. And remember the rule, it has to either directly precede or follow the subject. Well, it's certainly not following the subject, and it's also not directly preceding the subject. So this is a misplaced modifier. And if you read the sentence, you can see why this isn't a good idea, in addition to being grammatically wrong. Because she was so good at teaching and playing Frisbee, the Golden State Warriors. It sounds like you're describing the Golden State Warriors as being good at teaching and playing Frisbee, because of conventions of how we speak. So this is a case where not only is this grammatically incorrect, but if you think about it closely, it also doesn't make too much sense to write the sentence this way. So that's a misplaced modifier. And you should ask your class what they think we should do to fix it. I'll show you two possibilities. One is we follow the two suggestions that were outlined in the rule. First, we can move the modifier to directly in front of the subject. Because she was so good at teaching and playing Frisbee, Angela was drafted, blah, blah, blah. We're good. Or we can move the modifier after the subject. Angela was drafted by the Golden State Warriors because she was so good at teaching and playing Frisbee. Both of these are fine, grammatically correct, and make more sense upon a close listen than the previous way of writing. That's it for organization. We have two more elements, and the second to last one is clarity. Good, happy sentences have got to be clear. So let's talk about ambiguous pronouns. A pronoun, as we talked about before, is a substitute for a noun. I realized I had misorganized a slide in the last slide deck. So if you watch the video for the Elements of a Happy Sentence Part 1 slides, I've since added a slide explaining what pronouns are, because some students might not know. But you will have presented that, and so at this point students will understand that pronouns are substitutes for nouns, and that whenever you use a pronoun, it gets linked to a particular noun. This is just a refresher. Then the particular rule we're concerned with here is that whenever a pronoun is used in a sentence, the noun-pronoun link, the link between the noun and the pronoun, must be crystal clear. It cannot be ambiguous. If it's not crystal clear, then it's ambiguous, and the sentence is not grammatically correct. So, I don't know. What exactly does this mean? Let's look at an example. All right. Dumbo asked Mr. Mumbo about his friend's tasty gumbo, and he was quite pleased. I highly encourage you to try saying this 5 times fast. Yeah. So what's wrong with this? Well, his and he. These are pronouns, and there's some nouns, but the links between these pronouns and the nouns are certainly not crystal clear. Who is his? We have Dumbo and Mr. Mumbo. I don't know who his is. Could be either one. And depending on that, it completely changes the meaning of the sentence. Same thing with he. What is this talking about? Is it talking about Dumbo or Mr. Mumbo? I don't know. Could be the same for both. It could be one and then the other. Who knows? Why is this even a sentence? This is awful. Never write sentences like this. Tell your students never write sentences like this. And certainly, they show you one on the SAT, know how to correct it properly. What can we do? Well, we eliminate the pronouns. In this case, there's no way to use a pronoun here and make it unambiguous. There were 2 names said, both of which could be males, and so using his here is completely ambiguous. There's no way to know if you're talking about Dumbo or Mr. Mumbo. If you'd only said one name, you can use his, and it's very clear, but here, not clear. So a better way to write this is Dumbo asked Mr. Mumbo about Mr. Mumbo's friend's tasty gumbo, and Dumbo was quite pleased. This is a very clear sentence. Now we know exactly what's going on, and it's about 5 times harder to say 5 times fast. I sort of want to try. Dumbo asked Mr. Mumbo... No, I'm not going to try. Okay, proper homophone. Purple slide. Remembering, of course, that the purple slides are these 1600 material slides that you can either eliminate or go through briefly, but that I will go through in depth in the videos, just to make sure you know the information. So proper homophones, or homophone, or yeah, I guess those are the two ways of saying it. I usually say homophone, but you could also say homophone. A homophone is a word that sounds the same, homophones are words that sound the same but are spelled differently and have different meanings. So remember, this is in the broader category of clarity. These are words that sound the same but are spelled differently and have different meanings. And we need to keep these things clear. The SAT will require students to know the proper meanings of many common homophones. So what does that mean? Well, you couldn't already predict it. That means that they got to memorize the meanings of common homophones. You have to know the difference between except and accept. You have to know the difference between effect and effect, complement and complement, and illicit and illicit. Some of these maybe you are not even too confident about. If you're not, you should review them so you can make sure to clarify these to students. If they want that 1600, they need to know these. They don't just need to know those, they also need to know these. Eminent and imminent, lay and lie. Maybe that's easier because these are actually spelled differently, or actually sound different. Principle and principle, everybody always confuses those. And there, and there, classic, and its and its. These especially, there, and there, and its, show up all the time on the SAT. Even students not aiming for a 1600 should probably be familiar with the differences here. It's also just good to know for your own writing. Alright, so that's proper homophones, memorize stuff, have fun. Alright, this is either a very happy or very sad moment, depending on how you felt about these slides and these videos, but this is the final element of a happy sentence, refinement. A happy sentence has to be refined, which is basically a nicer way of saying there's a few rules that didn't fit into any other category, so I smashed them together into this category called refinement. Okay. First one is relative pronouns. A relative pronoun, I don't know what a relative pronoun is. I looked up definitions and it was complicated and I didn't understand it. So it doesn't matter. You don't need to know what a relative pronoun is for the SAT. It's just a type of pronoun that's relative. The important thing is that the SAT will require students to understand how to use 4 what are called relative pronouns. Who, whom, that, and which. Probably didn't know that these were pronouns, but they are. And students need to know how to use them. And the usage is governed by 3 simple rules. If they know these rules, they can solve any question the SAT throws at them regarding these pronouns. So rule number 1 is you use who or whom for human nouns and that or which for non-human nouns. This doesn't tell you anything about the difference between who and whom or that and which, but it tells you the difference between these pairs, human and non-human. So how do we distinguish who and whom? Well, that's rule number 2. You use who when you're referring to the subject of a clause, and whom when you're referring to the object of a clause. It's amazing. Something that we covered in the very first or second slide of this Elements of a Happy Sentence deck is appearing at the very end of it. The foundation really is important. Okay. Rule number 3 governs the distinction between that and which. You use which when there is a comma in the sentence, and you use that when there's not a comma. So these are pretty simple. I mean, at this point, students should be fairly confident about what a subject and object are, so none of these should be too bad. Everybody always freaks out, like, who versus whom? What is your grammar? Yeah, no, it's not that scary, as we'll see in a second. So a practice question. My friend, which I've known for many years, is moving to a faraway land. What do you think? Correct answer is whom. Oh my gosh. Correct answer is whom, that word that everyone's afraid of. Let's go through why everything else is wrong. My friend. Okay, my friend is a human. That means I have to use who or whom. Which, and you can see now why these are called pronouns, because my friend, and then I'm substituting this word for my friend. So I'm sort of using it as a pronoun. Which and that refer to non-human nouns. So I can immediately eliminate A and B. I know those are wrong. This has to be who or whom. And then things get a little trickier. Is it who or is it whom? So we just think, is this the subject or the object of this particular clause? Not the subject or object of the entire sentence, because obviously my friend is the subject of the entire sentence, but of this clause. Blank I've known for many years. You might think that it's the subject because it comes at the beginning, but actually it's the object. I is the subject, know is the verb, and the friend is what's known. It receives the action of knowing. So in this clause, even though it's written in this sort of backwards way, this word, whether it's who or whom, is the object. So we have to use whom. This is very, very, very tricky. This is like the upper bound of difficulty of how, of the type of question the SAT would ask about relative pronouns. All right. And now a second practice question. Jonna bought her daughter a toy airplane, which was all that little baby had ever wanted. How sweet. What's the correct answer here? Happens to be no change. Before we saw an example where using which was absolutely wrong. Here using which is fine. Here which refers to, it's a pronoun that stands for the noun toy airplane. So we know it has to be that or which. We can eliminate C or D. Then should it be that or which? Well, I said the rule was if you have a comma, you use which. If there's a comma, we use which, and the sentence is happy, just like that little baby with a toy airplane. Here we are, the final rule in this set of slides, proper prepositions, and it happens to be a purple rule. So what is a preposition? Well, a preposition is a word that shows the relationship between a noun and some other word in a sentence. Prepositions are everywhere. You've heard of a million of them. For, about, to, from, under, over, in, out, all of those are prepositions. Now there's a lot of prepositions, and unfortunately the English language has a lot, this should be underlined and in bold and in red, a lot of idiosyncratic rules about how to use specific prepositions properly. And if you've been paying attention, you should know that when I say the word idiosyncratic and then I have some sarcastic comment at the bottom of a slide, what's coming next is memorization is fun. Part 5. If you want a 1600, you can tell your students, then you can study the differences between proper and improper usages of particular prepositions. For example, it's not grammatically correct to say equally as important. You have to say equally important. Who cares? Apparently the SAT writers. You can't say meet with people, you have to say meet people, even though it sounds exactly the same when we say it out loud. But just in case that wasn't enough fun, there's also Memorization is Fun Part 6, where you can study the differences between preferable than and preferable to, and try and try to, among other things. And then there's Part 7, if you really want to have a good time, where you can study the difference between, let me say this carefully, you can learn how to pair prepositions with particular words when they have other words following them. That was not clear at all. But basically the word agree can be paired with any of these prepositions, but only when certain things follow the preposition. So agree to a proposal, but you agree on a procedure, but you agree with a person. Do you need to know this for the SAT? Yeah, if you want a 1600, they could ask you something really, really nitpicky and annoying like this. So it's purple, and I don't know. Memorize it if you want. Okay, so that concludes the elements of a happy sentence slides. The last slide is just a reminder to always be happy when you're learning about grammar or doing anything in life. All right, I'll see you next week.